only for the lecture. What is the? No, it is working. So this is maybe the first lecture I prepared ever in Korea. I was teaching Studio 7, 5th year, and they had to renew the campus of Sungkyunkwan in Myeongnyundong. Some of the case studies we saw were from that course. So I thought studying this architecture, which was very fresh for me, would be interesting. In the cover is one of the buildings of the main campus of Tokyo University. Right? And you see, this is not exactly the same we have here in Seoul, but it's kind of familiar. Right? This is what we call the Uchida Gothic. We will talk later about it. So important thing, let me try to get this out of the way. Maybe I can go down. I don't know. This is one of the limitations of Zoom. Okay, so one thing which is interesting is that the campus of the University of Tokyo has a lot of history. Actually, it is the palace of one of the lords, one of the samurai in Edo. Edo period is more or less similar in terms of history to the Choson period here. It's like a kind of defines the modern personality of a country, last historical period. Well, you have the Kagawa, one of the important clans, and the Maeda Yoshitsune put his palace in Tokyo in the center. So this is a historical map of that time. So one thing which was very clever in Tokugawa, the one who started the Edo period, is to keep all the war lords, the samurai, very busy, and to have them spending the money in ceremonies, in palaces, and to have them living near him in Tokyo, right? So you have to buy a big house. Of course, they were ready to war, but they have to have a lot of ceremonies, so they would be busy and they will spend a lot of money on things, and they will not have time to fight with each other. So this is what we call now the Hongo Street. And this is the place where the palace was, right? On the south is one pond. It's a famous Buddhist temple. The park of Ueno. If you're familiar with Tokyo, you may have heard about it. Ueno Park. One stream. And it's quite not far from the royal palace, from the imperial palace, actually, the castle of Tokyo. If we look at a modern map, curiously, the landscape is almost untouched, which is quite remarkable. This is what some of my colleagues insist has been the fabric, urban fabric, right? No problem. We have this. So it's the Google Maps. So the site, well, you can see how huge was the small palace, right? We still have the park. On the back is an extension, is the medical school. Of course, the hospitals are always huge. This is main campus, right? And you see in the center a pond. This is the remainings of the garden of the old samurai house. So this is something that keeping some elements of the, thank you. Maybe totally up, maybe easier. Or totally down, maybe also. You can just put something on top of it. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So the point here is how the map of the city is preserved through history, which for example, is something that in the history of Seoul is disappearing, right? We don't have this kind of traits. This idea is not mine. This is taken from one of the historians in Tokyo University who wrote a book called the Genius Loci, or Genius Loci, if you want to make the English, in which he started telling this case about how the place changes the use and the building system, but the spirit kind of remains in it. So Tokyo University has something similar to Korea University in terms of being in the center of the city and being part of the city, right? Akamon, the Red Gate, is one of the original gates of the palace, which has remained. Of course, here it is a wooden element, so it has been rebuilt many times. It is the original gate. And this is the most famous tourist spot, one of the tourist spots in Tokyo, right? So this is a group of tourists taking the photo with the guide speaking about the Red Gate and so on. Second is the central pond we commented before. Sanshiro is the protagonist of one famous novel of the Meiji period. So this pond actually is the pond with the heart shape. So it has kind of symbolism in the old house. But that book was so famous that everybody knows as the Pond of Sanshiro, and people go there just to revive the scenes of that famous novel. Right? And of course, this is how it is left the last. So the Meiji area is when Sanshiro appeared. The pond is original 17th century. And then this is modern construction, right? This is 1930s. Again, very connects with the building we are working now, the old buildings. Yasuda Hall, which is already Taisho era, it's already 20th century. It's before Showa. Well, don't worry about it. It was important because it was the place, not being just a clock tower, like the main building in our campus, which is so symbolic, but it's where, well, on the back, there's the language school where I learned Japanese for 6 months. So I was going everything. Look how interesting one monumental building has really domestic small gate, but this is like a human size, which is something you can find also in the British Gothic, because they were taught by British guys, right? So it is monumental, but you have like a really tiny things which are very human, which is quite interesting. Doesn't happen in our campus. Everything's monumental here, I think. Well, the point is this. This is the place where the students became strong in 1968, famous student revolution, and were 4 days fighting the police and making fire and so on. It was in the news. So that's very strong event, and it's not forgotten. And differently than Seoul there, this remains, the whole campus is there. Right? But that history protest was also in Seoul University. So 3 elements which are part, not just the university, but the whole city and the whole country at large. So important is keeping this place. That hall was, the service area on the bottom was used. So they have small, the language part, some kind of facilities, and the bookstore and some kind of things. But the building was so destroyed that was like unused for years. It was beautifully restored, and they opened just for my graduation ceremony. So it was the first act they had when I graduated. Still had hair at that time. So this is the image of the old paintings, right? How the house was. You can see that ceremony in the front. So samurais were really crazy doing all that kind of formal stuff, right? Spend a lot of money. But see how, even in all the prints, that red gate appears, right? The pond, right? Which is one of the elements, and so on. Another painting in which, again, we have the red gates, right? And again, a lot of things happening around. Of course, there's kind of the wallings, but you have all the commercial area near the palace, which still exists. More things, again, how we have a small wall, because actually it's not really military, because Japan was in peace, right? It's kind of military character, but not really. The castle is different, but it's like things, trees and small landmarks, if you want to see what we can see across the walls, and many things happening on the street, right? This is interesting because this is the pond. The pond was the most private part, but it's kind of always interest, right? Things you don't know, it's always like legends and illustrations and people thinking what those powerful people will do in their private garden. They would write haiku and do drawings and maybe some things which maybe you cannot tell so much as the other things. This is one of the drawings of the palace. So you can see the pond in the middle, which is like really the heart of that area. The palace of the samurai, then all the service area. That tells you how much money they had to spend to be there, right? And this is how much the palace expanded at the end of the period, right? It is like a horse riding places around here. I think it's the long space. Curiously, now the sports grounds are there. It's kind of fun coincidence, maybe. And all the areas for the servants, the army, and the logistics, and also. So when there was the need of a place for a modern Western style university, that family just donated the place. I don't know exactly the mechanism. I should study more, but we are more interested on the city and the history, on the architecture and the history itself. But interestingly, Tokyo University is not just the historical trait of an important part of the city and the country, but it's kind of a showroom of the history of architecture in one place. If you travel to Tokyo, which many of you do, that campus, you can see almost all famous architecture, from the first modern buildings up to probably Kengokuma or so, right? By the way, I didn't put the photo of Kengokuma here. But so the first buildings were the School of Astronomical Studies, right? This is already 17th century, but most interestingly is the Western Book Translation Offices. This is already Meiji, so this is the period in which Japan thought we have to modernize, otherwise they will eat us. And the first thing they did was to translate books, right? And they used just the buildings as they were, right? They have the existing spaces and they just started doing the work. Then we have right after the Faculty of Medicine, which is interesting. This is what I call the Kyoyofu Kenchiku, like a fake Western architecture. This is just 20 years or less than 20 years after trying to get, but you see the building is made by Japanese carpenters, just to be Western, so they have those vertical windows they see in the illustrations. You have this clock tower, which has become kind of a leitmotif of being Occidental, right? Clock towers become loved by everyone. And you have a porch, but you see the decoration is taken from the Buddhist temples because they see obvious the details should be their carpentry, right? So it's kind of a strange mix, and this is what they call the fake Western style. This building has been moved away from the campus because it is very nearby, reconstructed. You can visit it. This just to tell that fake Western architecture. This is not in Tokyo. This is another school, very famous, which they have this kind of a Western building with a clock tower, but then you have kind of Shinto entrance and windows just faking some kind of design. So this is the kind of buildings we have. The right is Ginza Avenue. This is already 20th century. One of the famous department stores still exists. Pity they demolished here, but they exist. And you see, most important is the clock tower, right? Interestingly, here the base are of 4 windows, not 3, but those buildings bigger. But you can see familiarity, right? Okay, so they started translating books, studying medicine, and of course, engineering and everything. They needed architecture also. So they were thinking, well, for army, which is the best country, well, actually, France has powerful armies. Let's study that engineering with the French. How about mechanical engineer or Germany? So, okay, they goes to Germany, and many technical words in Japanese are German. So the sewing machine, it's called a machine, which probably is nearer to German than it's to English, but I don't know. I don't know. That's many things. And in architecture, come on, the British Empire has. So they went straight to the Royal Institute of Architects and said, we come from Tokyo University. We want to have the best graduate of last year. Oh, it was Mr. Kondo. So very young Kondo was offered to organize the architecture studies in Japan. And this is late 1800s. So the modern architecture was like the eclectic, Gothic, classical things there, but it was the guy who brought the system, and he was able to build Gothic, really Cambridge style campus in Tokyo, right? And he had the Faculty of Law, so he was teaching and also building, very advantageous. It doesn't happen anymore. You teach, but do not build anymore. So we have all the photos of the buildings. There's no any intention to be Japanese here. It's totally implanted. And many commissions they did to foreign offices, the famous Japanese parliament, the Diet building, the architects, it was a German office, won the competition, and they tried to do something with some flavor of Asia. And they said, we do not want anything which resembles Asian. We want to be 100% European. So they had to change the style to not have any reference, at least not explicit reference to personal architecture. It was very radical. This is Mr. Kondo. So he was really young when he was to Japan. He was teaching for 8 years. He married a Japanese lady, and then he opened his practice and he remained in Japan for life. Many of his buildings, like the campus, were destroyed with the earthquake of 1923, maybe, but some remain. And some of the remaining buildings is the Orthodox Church, right? I don't know if this looks very Russian or not, but still you can see it in Tokyo, right? And he seemed the typical English gentleman. He looked happy in the photo. He looked, oh, I had my stand here. But there were people studying also in France. So the Yamauchi Hanroku also did the Faculty of Sciences, and this is more French, more classical in style. This is the building. The guy disappeared, but it's the building disappeared. The guy disappeared also, of course. So it was demolished. The building has been demolished. This is the guy, and some of his remaining buildings are in the photos. So this is really much more French. And again, not any intention to have any Japanese flavor there. Then Tatsuno Kingo is important because he really studied in Europe, but then he went back to Tokyo University and he studied with Condor, right? He was one of the most able, most famous. And his important work, he worked in Seoul. So he was so important that he was in charge of the designing the Bank of Korea, the one we have in the south, right, near Nandebon. Again, he did the Faculty of Engineering, but again disappeared. Both of them, the faculty and the Kingo. And this is the guy, also happy guy, and this is the building we all know, right? In which, you know, I think in this case, well, there's some British flavor, so, but there's some kind of small references to Asia, maybe more India imperial architecture than here, but it's hard to say, right? But again, the building you can visit. By the way, this is an extension case study. That building on the back is extension of the, so it's like adding a big tower to the existing building. Now the front, I think, is used as a museum. Am I right? Well, we have the oldest remaining building for those days. It's 1916. It is the Faculty of Physics, and it still is there, so you can visit it. This is really, really French European style. But in 1923, the big earthquake. Many of those buildings were basically masonry. Was not a good idea, right? So most works of the Condor, Hanroku, and those guys disappeared. At that time, of course, Condor already died, so he doesn't know his buildings disappeared. This is why he was smiling in the photo. But there's a very young, quite young at the time, Uchida Yoshikazu, quite a scary guy, but very clever. But he had studied in Tokyo University. He was in charge of the engineering, architecture engineering in the school, and he was in charge to rebuild the campus. So he had a compromise of making something earthquake-proof. So this is like the first large-scale reinforced concrete earthquake-proof buildings, one of the first examples we have, that still keep the personality of the campus. But he couldn't go to something which is already old-fashioned. 1923 is already like, as we saw with Asplund, right? It's kind of a classical, but we are more modern, right? Technique is changing. So he had this kind of compromise, and he did something intelligent. Well, he did a beautiful master plan for the campus. He keeps the pond. He works with the axis, right? So he elaborates a bit more human scale. Main axis with the clock tower. Most important build. So you have secondary axis with the library, which is Hongo's library. And the most important building in front of it, engineering number 1, where architecture is still existing, right? And here we have an historical ginkgo tree. This is a new area they bought. This is the Faculty of Agriculture. And this huge part is the hospital, right? But so it is very classical, but it's really some kind of rationalism. You can see some kind of, I don't think we need to relate, but you can see some connection to the Dutch planning and some kind of rationalism and so on. And beautiful axonometrics. So you can present your master plan like this and you will have a good critic, I think. And this is what we call the, let me see if I can show it, the Uchida Gothic orthodox style, right? So he developed this kind of Gothic style, but since he's using reinforced concrete, actually he can have more generous windows and a more kind of elegant buildings, not as heavy as the ones we saw before, right? And well, this is Gothic, this is classic. Well, if you're Orthodox, you say, come on, Gothic doesn't have round arcs there like that, right? But the spirit is Gothic, right? We are not historians. This is the problem with the words and the classifications. Yeah, you know, history is our life. So, and history of architecture is important, but thinking of history as just a classifying elements, kind of the file thing, just freezes things and makes architecture as an object. And you have this tendency of a study history of evolution is the most terrible, because it seems we have like a peak with a perfect period, and then everything before is like a imperfect and trying to get to that. And after that, everything is just corrupted and decadent. And this is a vision which really, I think, is totally nonsense, right? Everything has its context and has its reason of being, and Michelangelo should not be better or worse than the Romini later, or whatever came later. So again, for historians, this is a Uchida Gothic, right? Or Tokyo style. And for me, obviously, this applies as a style, as a spirit to the buildings in the Seoul or Kyungsung National University. And they have actually quite interesting buildings. This is the refectory. Here you have some sports facilities, some of the cooperative shops, and some of the clubs and the cafeterias and so on. And this building keeps that language, but you see it's quite modern. But it has this kind of a shape following one of the important roundabouts. The canopy is really on one side, so it's really in purpose asymmetrical in the entrance. And it has a beautiful stair, right? That stair is a joy with top light. The building you see is quite humble, so it's not luxury there. There's not like a oak on the walls, not stainless steel and the glass, and no. But the stair itself makes the space great. This was planned for demolition. I was very sad, but fortunately they kept it. This one thing I say, stairs is one thing I miss in Korea. Now the stair is concrete. The balusters are steel, and only the handrail is wood. But the stair is concrete. Yes, it is painted black, same as this beam, right? It's just painted. Okay, so everything is white. I don't know if it is original. Surely the handrails are original, but probably everything is white, and then the stair just has some kind of contrast. And there's some detail of the buildings, right? The Faculty of Literature. You see, this is exactly the same tiles we have here, identical, the same. We have more elaboration, more special tiles, right? I play with the textures. This reminds me some of the Dutch architecture, the sort of brick architecture, de Klerk and those guys who made kind of the expressionist, the modern historical thing. They're made a reference to Europe without leaving that style. Look at those vertical windows, the windows for the stairs, which follow the stair. So it's kind of functionalism there, mechanism. And those windows are the same we have for the toilet here, the toilet windows in our building. So this is the legacy of Uchida, quite important because the master planning remains. It was very successful and main buildings remain, but still, as all universities, we keep building, right? We need more and more laboratories, more research. And Tokyo University is really powerful university. They have a lot of means, a lot of work. So the campus becomes still the house for reflecting the new trends. One difference of Tokyo University and Koryo University is that even though everywhere apart from Uchida, which was special, but the new buildings are just decided by competition, right? You have always in general very good offices here, right? So they choose the best project, and it goes through, of course, a lot of committees, but really strict. Here, we do always by competition. We select always the cheapest guy, and that makes a difference. And you know, cheap is not always cheap, as we know. It's easy to say, but this kind of short-term vision of making things cheap because you have things right now and you don't care what will happen in 10 years' time. I think it's very bad policy, but it's just my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. But we have buildings. This building was finished in 1996. I cannot believe it needed a major renovation so early. Those buildings in Tokyo are getting near 100 years and they don't need so much maintenance. They're almost as original, right? Okay. So we have what we will expect. We can put some sellotape or some. Yeah, that's the problem of doing it not properly. Maybe we can put some, maybe the projector we don't use, maybe can be heavy enough, or this one, I think this is better. Okay, if it falls, we'll know, so that will bring some. Okay, so 3 actions: new constructions, improvement, and building extensions. So 2 of them refer to us. So I think it's very good in terms of case studies. Many of those examples are published. You can find information if you think they're interesting, but I will comment. I will not roll, right? I will comment what I think is important. So one thing that we found early, there was not air conditioned in 1930. And as the building gets used, they need more and more, right? And this was a small mess. And this is university, so they don't care so much about it being a monument. Fortunately, it has changed, but it demonstrates a need to take care of those things. Right? We saw in the artist house, whatever you want to call it, this was not so much as this, but they have very, very intrusive machines and cables of air conditioned. It was not nice, right? There are ways to do it. Other buildings happen the same, right? Well, you see extension and height, right? But obviously, this is laboratories for probably some kind of mechanical engineering and need kind of big ventilation and safety stairs and so on. So in some cases, this is kind of rough. And then we have the commercial invasion, right? Now we have Lawson's, Starbucks, and all those things there. But we have nice buildings. And I think we will see like a really first top figures. Kenzo Tange is the father of the Japanese modern architecture in new generations. Without Kenzo Tange, there's not Isozaki, not Toyoito. Without Toyoito, it's not Sana and not many others. So it's like the man who was creative but open enough not to make a big monument to his persona, to his own work, but really to open possibilities and to encourage young talents to develop their own work, right? And administration building is a great building. 1970, it's very much 1970s. He keeps the bricks, right? Same tiles, but it's definitely a modern building. Actually, it's a couple, a lower building to keep it a scale. And this is one of the few buildings which are kind of high rise. Very careful with the details. And obviously it is quite inspired in the famous Kevin Roach Knights of Columbus building, right? This is one of the choices we have for high rise, the cores in the four corners. Then Maekawa Kunio is not so well known, but it's a top figure. He was one of the Japanese architects who worked with Le Corbusier. And he's kind of silent. His constructions are not like super impressive, but he has quite a few nice museums in Tokyo, right? In Ueno Park, we saw near the university. And this is one of the lounges for meetings and for restaurants is the Sanjo Kaikan. This is just over the pond is by Maekawa. So it's nice architecture. Tiles are a bit larger. This kind of modern study he did, but we will not get into that. Then, interestingly, this is what we talk about the pastels, right? Uchida was very serious about those axes. This is like a both art, but rationalistic and helping to organize the campus. And axes are important. And there was in the first plan, it's kind of a Gothic axis. If you go building after buildings, you have main axis and secondary. So you have kind of this permeability. And that's kind of kept in some of the constructions, right? This is not a famous architect. And when they built it, I was already there. We're like critical. What are you doing in Gothic style with concrete in 1987? Right? Well, we did it more Gothic here in 2020, right, in the other campus. So this makes this kind of a quite progressive building. Actually, it's not bad, but the intention to give this kind of continuity without bringing the image when you need a building which is larger and more modern. Again, we have a concrete, not most of the stone is local limestone. There's not so much granite around Tokyo, but instead here they used concrete. Now you can see, this is what I think interesting there. You see people with their children going around, people going to paint. So the campus is like everybody's place. Is an area of the city where you go just to spend your time. The pond is just on the right, in the back, right? There was some kind of consumption there. Hisao Koyama was my thesis director, and he did a lot of works in the campus. This is one of the extensions in height. Quite interesting because he's following the rhythm, right? And even the proportions of the windows, but doing something totally different. The vault system was quite intelligent. Actually, it was competition. It was quite successful. It was very polished. This is as it was when I was there, no, in later trips, so probably 10, 12 years ago. This is just when finished, a better photo, right? And this is from above. So there is always this kind of a space of between new and old, just to give some kind of gap, some respect, but still keeping some of the rhythms. And then the vault is some kind of being soft or giving some kind of public character, but not being too intrusive. So it's kind of soft finishing to those buildings, which kind of worked well. This is the space inside. And this is one of the elevation drawings. Again, if you draw the elevations and details like this, you may have a good critic. But to draw like this, you have to be very sure you already got it right to the point. You don't do it when you are thinking. Right? But see how interesting is trying to be totally modern, but still having some kind of dialogue with the existing without much compromise. And interesting the section, right? How you add one element to the previous part. Koyama won also the competition for the University Museum. This is 1984. This is kind of a decaffeinated postmodern. Museums are difficult and facades are difficult. And well, let's pass over this. What is interesting is that Well, this is the back. Actually, the back is kind of functional. Actually, it has to be built very cheap. Again, this is a very rich, powerful university, but they are not trying to show off richness. Students' place and research place has a character, which is not like a Hyatt or Hilton hotel, right? You have to be humble. And this articulation keeps with the small scale of the commercial street behind. So it's trying to break the monumentality towards the street and keep the museum image to the front. This is the original wall of the university. But you see, it was a very difficult site, right? Very thin. So this tells us the importance to consider the whole context. The approach of the building, you change the axis, you get frontal, it's kind of ceremonial, but you have a lot of time to walk and to get used to the building with different perspectives. And then the building is just a set of rooms, right? With a very clear rhythm. It's kind of classical in some aspect. And the inspiration is clear from John Soane's museum we visited the other day. So Koyama traveled often to the UK and France. He liked very much those Gothic old buildings, and of course, John Soane. And Koyama was also a student of Louis Kahn. So you can see some flavor of Kahn in those elevations, right? Well, this is the reference. Sections we didn't see today by John Soane. And then the best building, the engineering building. This is at the end of one axis, right? And this building was extended after I graduated. Actually, I was offered to remain in the design team, but I didn't want to be a team. I wanted to be myself, so I went back to spend that time. But the extension is quite interesting. They had a courtyard, which became a drafting room, and then an addition on the back. So you can see the original facade and the added bay to house the library. They had a very good library. We wish we had it here, but this was like a very old and very hard to work with. Right now they have very nice space there. That's the library space from published material. Again, there is a lot of care to keep that existing facade, right? And the addition tries to be very light, very silent, so there's not competition. There's a contrast, but there is not, again, trying to make something over monumental. This is seen from the outside. You see they have ramps, so accessibility was one of the issues which were treated here, and so on. One more building, because again, it's my professor. I don't know how he wins so many competitions. So he did an auditorium in the other side, in the agricultural engineering part. I brought this because it's just one more example. It's just timber construction, right? But again, see, this is the main street, right? So you have one of the gates, one of the axes. So this building was using part of the garden. And it was very hard because you're making an auditorium, which is quite a solid building in a main entrance. So it's very hard to keep the balance. So he chose to articulate a lot of the building towards the street. So we still see the garden from the street, and the building becomes secondary. It's not, and then the timber and wood would be the theme, right? So you see the section from the street, the wall, and then the building with some volume in between. So the trees and then the articulation will make the building less monumental. Again, this is a kind of a section that you could do, right? Not just a building, but how the building relates to the street and how it affects the perception of people passing by. This is very clear a design section. So we know they know how to build this, but we are showing just the space and the envelope. We don't need to show whatever is inside. Of course, this is not ignorant. We know probably this kind of a truss inside. So we can guess what happens, but we're not distracted. We just see the space. So there's the interior elevation here, together with the context. This is a nice way of drawing trees, by the way. And a little bit Louis Kahn style. A bit different, but Kahn, was painter. He did many drawings. This is the building. Again, timber structure, curtain wall on the outside. Being formal, public, but still humble and not over invading the space, right? What is the interior spaces, the lobby, and so on. This is kind of second class. So physics, elementary particles, those guys get all the money, so they need more space. Architecture is so humble, but physics is super. So they just kept just the colonnade of the building and they just built up the rest, right? Still keeping the materials and the bay windows. Sometimes there's no choice. You have the possibility to build so much that having it right is not easy. At least they have a nice atrium and some elements which keep the memory, but I wish we could do a bit better in those cases. This is economics research building, which again has the same problem. There's a lower part, and I think this is like a 1970s building, right? But see that again, even if the building, I don't think it's especially beautiful. Also, it is kind of carefully made. It has this kind of tiny scale, the promenade, which at least is reminiscent of those Gothic details we saw before. You see this. Okay. One other of the brutal extensions. Again, this is 1970s new building and just a bridge to connect. Not much interest. And this is one of the 1970s ugly buildings that they got a new layer, right? So the back is 1960, 1970. The front layer is 1980. Trying to have a little more connection with existing buildings in terms of material, windows, and some kind of formal elements. Again, not great, but at least the intention is interesting. This is brutal. This is a nice building, engineering building number 2, right? This is one that we demolished here. They kept it. And the action is just to, well, they cut the half of the building, just literally cut. And for the part that remains, they put just the building on top of it, right? Not touching, overlapped. It has one of the most published ones. Not because it is the best, it's because one of the most radical in some sense. It is radical. And this is new and old, so literally a building is cut, right? And then you have an entry inside. This is intelligent, so you have a void between new and old, and that's kind of public space. And this, the back is totally modern. Actually, I think this is one of the tricky things in those renovations. If the new does not stand the quality of the old, you're in a very difficult position, right? When you see together at the top and the bottom, it's okay, but you go back and this is kind of so ordinary, so common. So why so many gestures? How so many? You would expect here to have the climax of that modernity, right? And it's like could be this building. Well, Yoshino Ashihara is an interesting guy. He did many buildings, and one of those is the sports grounds, right? Curiously, in the same area of the horse riding place, of the samurai place. So he did, again, he went underground to avoid changing the profile of the university, and he just replicated the elements of the exterior inside and then did something new. This is blue because the main space is the swimming pool, indoor swimming pool, which is under the soccer ground. And in the back, you have the medical school, right, which is huge. You see the openings are larger because even in 1930, they knew they would have ambulances and some larger trucks, so they needed a different scale. Ashihara, he was famous because of the Sony building, one of the, again, most published buildings in the central Tokyo. It was demolished like a couple of years ago. And then we have Tadawando. Tadawando was the dean for 3 or 4 years in the School of Architecture, and he won one of the memorials for the university. It's kind of the auditorium and seminar rooms. And of course, Tadawando is all concrete, no bricks, no tiles, don't ask. Also, he did brick buildings when he was younger. The problem is, again, this is a gap between the library, that huge library we saw, and the wall. And he could build 4 floors. But Ando said it's a pity to make such a massive building between the street and the library. So he did 4 floors, only 2 overground and 2 underground. And this wall is hiding that sunken garden, which goes to the underground. This is the slit you see around there in the wall, right? So you can see what happens behind. This is at night, so it's the wall libraries on the right. And this is the sunken, well, from two angles, right? So it's two photos. So you go really 2 floors down, and this height allows you to have the big meeting halls or auditoriums inside. This is at night. And this is the space between the wall and the building, and this is the auditorium. So the building is very narrow, but you can have all this without being too close. And he said Ando said his inspiration was the Sanju Sangendo temple in Kyoto. Which is the long wall, right? In the street, just having those layers between the street and the building. This is how we see from the street. You can see how successful was it. Actually, this is not a good photo. If I go next time, I will try to make a better one. It's not very flattering to the back, but okay, imagine a 4-floor building would be a bit more. This is a night. Oh, this was, actually I did. Let me go back. I forgot that photo. So you can see across the street, the library in the back, right? So it's an interesting point. Engineering buildings, element number 14, not great thing. Just keeping the tiles with some kind of less modern styles. And this is the main gate with the main clock tower I saw before. Somebody asked about the street. So actually I have the photos, but I didn't want to go through the albums because last time I was in Tokyo was 2019, just before the corona. And I have to look for them, but this is the street view. So campus is really green area. This is why architects are always so worried to add something near the wall. The front is like a tiny buildings, which are demolished and has very thin and tall towers. We should have better photos than this, but they had something they call the pencil towers because they were really thin and tall. This was the Graduates Club, nice building, probably 1940s, 50s, which was demolished to make an expansion for the old, well, this is the Red Gate, and this is all the storage, right? So in Japan, since everything was in timber, they had the habit of having like a very strong brick buildings, fireproof to keep important documents and treasures. This was the one for the university. So again, Koyama Atelier, this is his atelier, right? Won the competition. Kind of hate him, but he won the competition. So they did 1 to 50. This is a 1 to 50 model. So it's a huge model with the buildings nearby, the context, the trees, and the extensions they proposed. There's the whole thing. So what he did is to make the extension. The program was quite brutal, but still they have to make some kind of connection with the existing building, still the gap, and create a new axis within the university, giving a new entrance and another open space, which is kind of those sequences we have throughout the campus. And following some of the realism materials, but being both classical and modern in some way. And then this is just to end because we could go forever. Interestingly, there is a very strong committee of the campus preservation and planning. So they have a plan and they renew it every few years. And they decide what to keep and what to renew. And still they try to coordinate with the regulations which allow for more building height and so on, right? And interestingly, it's published. If you can navigate, you can find those documents. So you see, for example, how important is the green areas are mostly national important cultural asset. So it's a huge amount of green, right? The yellow is areas which are not preserved, but they are renewed and improved to keep in the whole network. So if it was our university, we would find so much parking spaces, right? You know, so much lost opportunities to increase the asphalt. Actually, there was more asphalt when I studied there. That decreased, and there's less car and more green spaces. Just the opposite of what we do here. Then this is interestingly the axis and the important spaces with the area of influence. and which axes are principal and which is secondary, right? Previously, the main axis is not, but this huge axis is just going from side to side, linking the two campuses, right? So access, that's something we do often. Then the high-rise zone. So you see that a very part of the campus, the dark and gray, is high-rise. And this is one of the difficulties the architects have to combine with the existing character of the school, because look at 10, 15 floors, which really clash with existing buildings. Then, well, this is a zoning. Okay, just common areas. See, importantly, this kind of border between the library and the street, right? Tadawando building is around here, right? Using those spaces. And then this is by colleges. Of course, the engineering is in this area. You don't need to know anything else. And then this is the maximum volume you can build. And you can see here, let me go back. This is the building I commented with the round space with the stairs, which is quite interesting. And it was planned to be demolished. It was really, really almost going to the competition to make something new. Right, so it appears like buildings which can be disposed of. No, this is the last map I downloaded later, and this is already preserved, so it will not be demolished. This is the brutal extension we have there in the building. And the library has been renewed recently, but I didn't bring the photos, right? And this is the steps of renovation, several plannings, which didn't go into effect. So this is just one example to see how there is a lot of care in the planning and things change. So I didn't update for a long time, but if I go to the plan now, things may be changing, right? But interestingly, those people of Tokyo University have succeeded on continuing a history which comes from the 17th century, right, 1600s. And still they keep in pace with the needs of modernity with more or less success, right? But the campus is there. You go there after 20, 30 years and still recognize the places, and the places exist. Things change, right? And that's not so easy to say in other places, right? Somebody who studied in this university 30 years ago probably will not recognize the campus, at least this campus. Main campus maybe, right? So this is the back gate. Again, doors, you don't need to over-design, but it's nice to have some gate which is unique of that university. And this is known the end, but it's not the end, right? There's a never-ending story. This is why we said there's not a final point. And this is the beauty of this kind of elements. So I could add chapters, but I don't want to make this very long, right? But it keeps growing and being alive and used according to the needs without needing to destroy everything that was before. Good. Any question about this? For this, I have a script. So, because I did a long time ago. No questions? No comments? Okay, so that gives you a bit more context on the place, right? Let me stop sharing this. I think I put last year, let me see if I find it, because in terms of materials, the conditions is so clear that I brought more details. Okay, so we can open this. Let me see if I can share. Is the finder? Yeah, it is there. Well, this is obviously not Tokyo. This is well known, right? This is one of the famous renovations. Actually, this is a case study. which is in the not too bad. Has nice qualities, it's nice in scale. It's a bit rough in terms of the design. One of the roughest things is the connection of new and old, which happens in the back, is just a clashing without any kind of care. Right? But interesting case, right? It has good points, things we can consider, and things which are not so great. In some blog in Korea, I read this was a Park Leon project, but I'm not sure. I never saw anybody telling that, because this is a very controversial building. This is where people were tortured and killed by the police here in Korea, I heard. It's interesting it's kept like that, right? But I don't know who did it. For sure, it's a Korean architect. And in some place, somebody said, this is Park Ki-leong. I don't know. So this is from the Japanese period. In front is just a Gyeongbokgun. Right? By the way, on the back, this sign is fantastic. I think Chelkoba tree. Well, this is the courtyard of Tokyo University. So this is the courtyard of the building. We see that extension. This is the drafting room, which is kind of a glass box putting what was the courtyard. This is like our drafting room, but on steroids. Yeah, this is the space. So they have really high space mezzanines and really place where people are happy to go. And you see a mess as everywhere. Architecture school cannot be clean. We need to have models and paper everywhere. This is the new and old building. So it's just intentional to change the color, but still have, again, some gap, right? This is the sandstone used in the extension, right? And this is the backside. And this is the connection. Again, difficult thing, but still they try to put some gap and some careful for the set of new and old. This detail is always difficult and important. Actually, this was not for the materials. Well, this is the corner of the engineering building, really modern cantilevers, right? I think my desk was next to the window was one on the right over there. Okay, this was not the photos I wanted to show, but anyhow, I showed them. I don't know if I should show this. Let me stop sharing. So did anybody take the history of contemporary architecture class? Because Professor Kim Hyun-sop actually teaches this architect. So I benefited from that. So that complements a little bit what you said the other day. I will try to share it. Okay, so it is not shared, so I have to share. So, okay, this is the photo of Aklian. This is his timeline. Don't look at all the notes. But he was from 1898. And then he graduated in 1919, just 21 years old. And for 13 years, he was working for the government, right? 1932, when he opens his office with employees, and then he works for 11 more years until he dies, 1943. So he has like a 24 years of professional life. And the building we are working is just right after he gets independent. I have a note here. They were calling him the motorcycle. He was really expressive, engaging, vital, but stubborn his way. You can see by the photo, right? Like, again, scary guy. He was studying the Gyeongsang Technical College, and as a public employee, he worked in the construction of the government building of Gyeongbokgun. Was the only Korean which appears as one of the people in charge of it. Well, this is the building, right? It is demolished. but he was working there. 1931 don't look at the comments because they are not useful for us. This is one house which still he was not independent. This is the one I'm not sure I saw somewhere. This is the bank, which actually it was interesting what you showed the other day. So there's more things that we should comment. I was watching your uploaded drawings, and this was more interesting than it seems. The comment is more than this, it's just symmetrical. This is the department store, so close to Ginza, right? But like downsize it. This is where now all the Samsung building stands in the Chonga. It's kind of a robot building. It's kind of a co-working space. We work. Or it's just the Chonga corner. And this is one building. I think is not. I think we can visit it, right, if it is open. But it's one of the most modern-looking buildings he did. And again, he uses this kind of element. Probably interesting is the decidedly modern, and in this case, at least in the photo, the structure looks like a much more regular. It's a much more relaxed building, right? And there are more. So I took note of more buildings he might have done, but that's interesting thing. Yes. 37 maybe. No, because no, this is another building. This is 1938, right? So I found references to other buildings of his, but anyhow, well, that's interesting information. I don't share this because it has many annotations, which maybe are not worth sharing. So important thing from those history documents is to get the data, some of the information, but you need to have your interpretation, right? Because we are interested on the architecture as architecture, not as history. And many of the comments there are really not helping. And many things you will read in books, also not interesting. Telling that the bank building is Western classical because it is symmetrical, it's like saying nothing. Symmetry is very common effect in any architecture in the world. So, but well, important information. One thing which is interesting is how one Korean was able to graduate, to work for the government, and then become independent, and still keep that kind of very Korean character, right? Some of his texts are telling Japanese architecture, Japanese house has no matter. It's like a paper. House needs to mass, needs to embrace people, right? Needs to have some kind of power. It's like a really, we cannot live like Japanese. This is a different climate, different culture. We have different feeling for the construction. And you can see that in the buildings, right? So I think there is a Japanese features in this building, but somewhere inside is a different spirit trying to appear there. Okay, enough for this because you have to talk a lot today. Let me stop this recording. Those online, anything more to ask?